Hello, and welcome back to HHH, the podcast where we talk about the horrible humans in history. I am your host, Angela Pearson, and if you guys are liking this podcast, please make sure you subscribe and share this with your friends. Anyone who enjoys murder or history, I'm sure will also enjoy this podcast, so feel free to share. I think we're having a good time, and if you're having a good time, let other people know about it. Today, I'm excited because we are going to go back to the serial killer genre for a little bit. And this serial killer is actually one of the first serial killers recorded in history. She used all of her power and influence to hide her horrible crimes. And she was even dubbed the Countess Dracula. They believe she inspired that. She killed up to 600 girls/women over the course of 35 years. That's about 17 murders a year. And she was so horrible that people could not possibly believe the rumors about her, but they all turned out to be true. So today, we are going to be talking about the infamous Elizabeth Bathory. And guys, hang on, because if you thought H.H. Holmes or our nice little nurse, Jolly Jane, were the worst possible people, oh, you haven't seen anything yet. So hold on and join us here on HHH for another horrible human in history. Let's jump right in to Elizabeth Bathory's childhood, where she came from. So she was born August 7th, 1560. Yeah, that's right. 1560. We're going way back, guys. This is in Hungary. And at this point in time, so I will spare you all the really boring political details that were happening at this time. Just know that Hungary and the Ottomans were constantly at war. Not only that, you also had the Protestants and Catholics constantly at war with each other. And this was a time when brutal punishment was carried out on anything. Like if you stole something, your hand got chopped off. They would kill you if they didn't believe that you were womanly enough. So This is the atmosphere that Elizabeth Bathory was born into. And it was war and murder and brutality. So that'll give you a little bit of background as to how she turned out the way she did. But she was born to Grigory and Anna Bathory. And she also had a brother named Stephen. Now, when she was a child, Elizabeth had severe health problems. She actually had a lot of seizures, and they believe that she suffered from epilepsy. A lot of people attribute that to the fact that her parents were actually first cousins. So at this time, there was a lot of inbreeding within nobles because, you know what, they wanted to keep their blood pure. They had to keep that bloodline pure and replace all of the leaders with their own offspring. So a lot of inbreeding was happening. So her parents were first cousins, so they believe that is a big reason why Elizabeth suffered from epilepsy. But she also was born with a silver spoon in her mouth. Guys, her family was so wealthy that the Hungarian government borrowed money from her family to save the country. They were so wealthy and so well known throughout Hungary. They were like the Kardashians of the time. So they were very popular, very well known, and very, very wealthy. And she lived through such brutality and violence around her. Here's one of the stories. It's believed that when she was a child, she actually witnessed a gypsy man who had been caught stealing. Um, his punishment, guys, they cut open a horse and sewed him into the horse while he was alive, so he would die as the horse decomposed. He couldn't get out. It is said that she laughed at this when she saw it. She thought it was funny that she saw this kind of violence, and she wasn't offended at all about violence. In fact, she seemed to really be drawn to violence and enjoy violence when she was a kid. And back then, servants and peasants didn't really matter very much. Like, royalty and the upper class could basically do whatever they wanted to them. They could hit them, they could abuse them, they could flat out kill them, and no one would bat an eye. So this is what Elizabeth was brought up into. So that was the attitude of the day. Now, when she was 10 years old, she was engaged to a 15-year-old. Now, just picture that, a 10-year-old engaged to be married to a 15-year-old, and his name was Baronet Nadasti. That's how you say it, Nadasti. I swear, I actually looked up how to say these names before I recorded this, and still can't do it. It's a trend, guys. I'm sorry. Anyways, he was a Hungarian count, so he had a lot of power, and by marrying him, her family was going to just increase the amount of power that they were going to have in the Hungarian nation. So supposedly, there's a rumor that before they got married, Elizabeth had an affair and got pregnant and gave the child away because she couldn't raise it. Well, her soon-to-be husband found out about this and found the man, had him castrated, and then threw him to a pack of wolves to devour him alive. This is such a romantic gesture, can I just say. He is clearly a winner and is following along the same trend as Elizabeth, enjoys brutality. So that's so great. I tell you guys, they are a match made in heaven. So they were married May 8th, 1575, when she was only 14 years old. 4,000 people attended their wedding. So, like I said, they were popular. To have 4,000 people in the 1500s attend your wedding, you're a big deal. People know you. But you know what? The man she married was perfect for her and horrible for the rest of the world. So they actually ended up having 7 children. I think only 5 of them survived. And the craziest thing is Elizabeth was actually an amazing mother. She did so well at raising her children and was so kind and so caring and so loving towards her children. That's why what she does in the rest of her life is so mind-boggling. But it makes me think of all of those men that worked in the concentration camps during World War II and the Nazi occupation of Germany. A lot of those men and women were good family men, were good parents and loving and kind husbands, or amazing wives who were so caring with their children, and then they would go back to work the next day and carry out the most brutal, horrendous things ever. And that's kind of what I'm seeing with Elizabeth, is she kind of had this dual nature where she was kind and loving and sweet and caring for her children. But behind the scenes, when they weren't around, she turned into a giant monster, a brutal, brutal monster. Now, part of that was her husband actually taught her how to torture people and how to inflict pain and the best way to do it. So they were like 2 peas in a pod. He was frequently gone fighting wars against the Ottoman Empire. He was actually known as the Black Knight of Hungary. He was well known for being violent and brutal in battle. And when he would come home, they would bond, and basically it was like their date night. They would torture people, and it was often servants that they would torture. So they would do it together as a way to bond and spend time together. How awful. Like, seriously, that's your date night. So some of the things that he taught her to do was putting paper soaked in oil in between their servants' toes and then lighting it on fire and letting it burn out. So it would burn their peasants' toes. Also, they would put needles under fingernails. He taught her how to do that. And guys, the gift that he gave her, oh, so romantic. I can't even comprehend what a sweet gesture this was. One day, he presented her with a bear claw. A bear claw. And do you know why she was so excited to receive this gift? It's because she could use the bear claw on her servants. If she was not pleased, she would use it to scratch up their skin and to cut them open. So she saw it as the most romantic gift ever. And he was praised as being such an amazing husband because of it. But that's the kind of couple they were. They were a power couple in the sense that everyone knew who they were. They were super wealthy, had a lot of influence across the nation, had a ton of land, many, many castles. But behind the scenes, they were both sadistic torturers and horrible, horrible people. So when he would leave for war, he ended up leaving Elizabeth in charge of his whole estate. And like I said, they were at war with the Ottoman Empire. And there were many times that their estate was threatened by the Ottomans. And Elizabeth had to defend the land from the Ottomans all by herself. So in today's sense, as far as running their estate and keeping it functioning and then also protecting it from the Ottomans, she was a boss babe. I tell you what, she was strong and independent and able to take care of things. She was really good at keeping their home running and protecting it from the Ottomans by herself because her husband was off fighting a war. Now, she wasn't aware of this, but the war was depleting their funds, severely depleting their funds. But Elizabeth didn't really know about it because they still lived a very lavish lifestyle, and her husband continually brought her expensive, lavish gifts, like bear claws. Who doesn't want a bear claw? Come on. Now, around this time, while her husband was off at war, a very important person entered into Elizabeth's life. Now, I know what you're thinking. I mean, she's already really horrible and really awful. Well, when Anna Darvolia, I think that's how you say it, Darvolia. Yeah, Anna Darvolia comes into their lives in 1601, there's a drastic change that comes over Elizabeth. Anna becomes Elizabeth's biggest accomplice. And the change that comes over Elizabeth is even noted in her servants' comments and journals. Instead of just being brutal and enjoying torturing people, Anna Darvolia teaches Elizabeth how to kill and the joy of killing. So before it was just torturing and making people miserable, but Anna is the one who introduces Elizabeth to actually killing her servants. So now Elizabeth is becoming more brutal, more harsh towards her servants. And in 1604, January of 1604, her husband would actually pass away from a mysterious illness while he was in battle. Now, this mysterious illness was very strange because it would paralyze his legs. They didn't know what was happening, but randomly his legs would become paralyzed. And this happened to him while he was in battle, and he ended up passing away. He was, at this time, she was only 44 years old. And between Anna coming into her life and her husband passing away, something snapped in Elizabeth's mind. And her cruelty, I know it's hard to believe, but her cruelty would be taken to the next level because of her loss and the tragedy that was the loss of her sadistic partner in crime. So, at first, Elizabeth was totally content just using her own servants to fill her lust for violence. She would bring any of her girl servants. It was always the women that she would torture. And she had access to over 400 servant girls throughout her entire territory. To give you perspective of how much power this woman had, 400 servant girls. And it said that her youngest victim was to have been 11 years old. And she was totally fine torturing all of her servants because, number one, like I mentioned before, no one would notice when a servant went missing. They were dispensable. They were just like animals to her. Nobody noticed because there were no records kept about servants because they were peasants. They didn't matter. And rumors began to swirl when family members actually started asking about their daughters, and they would just be brushed off and turned away and told to leave Elizabeth alone. So rumors started circulating that something suspicious was happening at the castle that Elizabeth lived in, but no one had any proof. It was just a bunch of servants' families claiming that they had gone missing and they had not heard from them and no one had seen them. But again, they were just brushed off because they were servants. Servants and the normal peasants couldn't complain against anyone in the upper class. That was a big no-no. No one would listen to you because you had dirty blood. Why would they listen to you? So she was deeply protected by her Bathory Nadasti name. She was basically untouchable. No one was willing to stand up for her. Everyone was afraid of her, and not necessarily in the sense that she would come and murder them, but like she was part of the upper class. Like she could do anything to their family. So everyone was very scared of her. Well, before her husband passed away, they were at church one day and, well, actually they weren't at church. I just lied to you. They weren't at church. There was a priest that Elizabeth frequently called to her home to provide the final rites, the funeral rites for the girls. So they would call this priest, and the priest started noticing that he was getting called to the Bathory home, the Bathory castle, very frequently, like too frequently. And he, the last time that they called him to perform these funeral rites, he turned to Elizabeth and said, and I quote, "Your grace should not have acted so because it offends the Lord, and we will be punished if we do not complain to you and criticize your grace. And in order to confirm that my words are true, we need only exhume the body, and you will find that the marks identify the way in which the death occurred." He knew what was happening, and he was being very bold and risking a lot by confronting her face to face and telling her that he knew what she was doing, basically, and that he was aware of her killing these innocent girls. Well, Elizabeth did not take kindly to this. She was furious and stormed away and left it to her husband to sort this out. So she was confronted by a priest, and that's it. And nothing happened after that because her husband was able to smooth out the whole affair. Because again, remember, hitting your servants, you know, hurting them in any way, or even you could even kill them and it wouldn't matter. Like if you were upper class, it didn't matter. Like you can't be punished for doing those things to your servants. So he was able to smooth it over with the priest. And from what I could tell, he never went back to perform any more rites, but I could be wrong on that one. But soon Elizabeth got really tired of having to replace and retrain her staff over and over and over again. So she decided to go about recruiting girls from the surrounding towns and villages. She promised the families that these girls would be trained and it would give them an opportunity to change their lives and become more than just a peasant and earn more money and yada, 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 yada. So she had a lot of towns in her area that they controlled. So if she had access to 400 serving girls, just imagine the reach that she would have by recruiting girls and women from the towns surrounding her. She had access to a lot of people. So she would lure them in with the promise of training and a better life. And then when they would come to live with her, that is when the torturing would begin. She executed many, many different types of torture. And, you know, I try and keep this pretty PG, just so you know, like, I don't like vanity and I don't like getting too detailed. So you'll notice I don't really go into a lot of detail about the goriness, but this is your warning. If you are listening with children around, what she does is really horrible. So I'm going to give you a second to either, you know, pause it and wait till there aren't kids around. But it's so, like I mentioned, she is way worse than H.H. Holmes. She is way worse than Jolly Jane. And this is why. So her different types of torture included, she had mechanical cages that she could put her victims in, and spikes would spring out and shoot blades into the individual. She would, she had cages with steel spikes that, you know, the ones you've seen that are like a coffin that you stand in and there's spikes, kind of like that. She had those. There's a story that one time she was too sick to be able to make it down to the torture chamber in the bottom of her castle. So she requested the girls be brought up to her. And when she had the girls come into the room, she ended up biting chunks of flesh off of the girls for her own enjoyment. She would just rip the flesh off of the girls. Obviously, she would beat them. She would stab them. She would burn them to the point where she would light the hair downstairs on fire just to torture these girls. She would poke them with hot pokers and just see how much she could inflict upon these women until they would just give up and die. She would push them to the edge. Now I told you earlier that she liked to put needles under fingernails. Well, after her husband died, she would take that to the next level and she would put the needles under the fingernails. And then she would say, if it hurts the whore, she can pull it out. And the girls would take that as permission to pull the needles out from underneath their fingernails because it was hurting. Well, if the girls did this, she would cut off their fingers. That would be her excuse for cutting off their fingers, is being too weak to withstand the pain that she was causing. So she's a gem, guys. She's a gem. One of her favorite ways to torture people. And it was slow torture. Slow torture was always her preferred choice. She didn't like the immediate kill. She liked to drag it out as long as possible. And her favorite way to do this was to take several naked women, put them outside in the cold in the middle of winter, and pour water over their bodies, and just continually put water over them until they froze to death. And frequently they would do this so much that the bodies would actually freeze to the ground. They couldn't move them because they were frozen to the ground. This woman was so sadistic, like so horrible. And her husband actually gave her the idea of that one too. So, a power couple, tell you what, so great. But the longer she was left alone and the longer that no one interfered with the horrible things she was doing to these women, the worse and worse the tortures got. And she would hurt them like she would. I won't go into any more detail, but just know she was horrible in what she did to these people. And it got to the point where she was killing so many girls that they didn't know what to do with the bodies. So they first would put them in the cemetery, but then they started running out of room in the cemetery. So they would bring them into the cemetery and then just not bury them. Then they just started throwing them over the castle walls for wild dogs to eat them because they had no place to put them. So they would just throw the wild dogs out. And then they would also throw the bodies into rivers because, they would get washed away. So there were so many, they genuinely didn't know what to do with them. So they just started throwing them wherever. Now, Elizabeth did not do this alone. We know that Anna was her accomplice. We know that Anna was her biggest accomplice. But she had other people helping her in this torture, which is mind-blowing because all of these people are sadists. Like, they are horrible. Anna Darvla, I can't say her name. I'm just going to call her Anna. Anna was supposedly a witch who believed in the dark arts and all of that kind of stuff. So it makes sense that she would be into torturing because she was into the occult and the dark arts and that kind of evil stuff. But she also had a couple other accomplices. One was the nurse who actually looked after Elizabeth's children by the name of Ilona Joe, and then her friend Dorca. Isn't that a great name, Dorca? Sorry. They had some phenomenal names back then. But Ilona and Dorca would help with the children. These are people that would care for Elizabeth's children. Like I said, people can have this dual nature of being kind and understanding and caring, and also on the other side, be the worst people who just want to hurt others for the pleasure. Now, Anna and Dorca would often compete for Elizabeth's approval and compete to prove who the most violent woman could be. Like, they took turns trying to prove to Elizabeth who was worse, who could do the worst to these poor girls. And then there was one other accomplice. Well, actually, there's a couple. Sorry, I needed to scroll down on my list a little further. So we had a washerwoman named Katali, bless her soul. She tried to help these girls. She often received many beatings for trying to help these girls. She would try and get them water and get them food, and she would be punished for trying to help them. But she did also help with the torturing. And then there's Arezi Majorva, she is another supposed witch who helped Elizabeth in all of her torturing and those kinds of things. And Janos Uvari was the only man who actually helped Elizabeth with the torturing and killing. He was a disfigured dwarf who would often stand and watch from the side and shout sexual obscenities at the girls as they were being tortured and be very sexual with the girls. Now, a lot of people think that Elizabeth was sexually motivated by this, and a lot of her torturing and abuses did focus on the genitalia of the women. So it is very possible that this was something that Elizabeth got a lot of sexual pleasure from. And it's pretty heavily believed that that's why she did a lot of this, and especially why she did it to girls and nobody else. But Janos was often the one shouting obscenities and enjoying it for that reason. So eventually, Elizabeth is going to run out of these village girls. People are not going to want to send their girls to her home anymore because they're vanishing. All of their daughters and sisters are vanishing when they go to the castle. So, as rumors started to swirl and people became more and more suspicious as to what might be happening up there, they became more and more reluctant. So, Elizabeth had to change up her tactics. She decided that she would start targeting upper class girls by creating a finishing school for girls. Now, this could be the beginning of her downfall because Elizabeth truly believed that she was invincible and could do whatever she wanted. But now she was starting to go after those upper class girls. And I don't know, we'll see. She could or could not get away with it. Only this story will tell. But Arezi, the other witch, so not Anna, but the other witch that was involved with Elizabeth, convinced her that if she started taking lives of the noble girls, her finances would improve. So she believed that if she started targeting these upper class girls, that all of her financial woes would be taken care of, ironically. So Elizabeth there's a story where she came across this upper class girl who had a beautiful singing voice. It was just gorgeous, and Elizabeth loved it. So she invited this girl to come and live with her, to come and sing for her at this finishing school. So when this girl came and Elizabeth invited her to sing for her, the girl was super, super nervous because I'm sure everyone had heard the tales that Elizabeth was brutal and harsh. And so this girl was super nervous and actually did not do well while she sang. And so, of course, Elizabeth, being furious and disappointed in the horrible performance, ordered her to be tortured and killed. So Elizabeth tortured this girl and killed her because she did not sing well for Elizabeth. So, like I said, Elizabeth thought she was invincible. So as these upper class girls started coming to her quote unquote finishing school and then disappearing, people started noticing at this point. Before it was all just rumors and it was a bunch of peasant talk. But now people started to take notice and they started to complain. So this triggered an investigation. In 1610, King Matthias of Hungary ordered an investigation into Elizabeth and sent George Terso, who actually used to be a really close friend of Elizabeth's late husband, and even promised him that he would take care of his wife after the passing of her husband. Terso was a very close family member and knew Elizabeth really well, but he was ordered to investigate Elizabeth and what was going on. And Terso had more loyalty to the king, thank heaven, than he did to his previous friend who had passed away. Now, bringing charges against an upper class member was very rare and so unheard of that Terso had to be 1000% sure that something horrible was going on within the walls of Elizabeth's castle. So he took a lot of time to investigate and look into disappearances and all of those kinds of things. But in December of 1610, Elizabeth was finally arrested. And Terso worked with the king to try and prevent her from going on trial. We'll get to that in a second. So when Terso went to go arrest Elizabeth, he wrote this to his wife. He said that upon entering, they immediately found dead bodies of servant girls in the courtyard. They found a total of 9 bodies, bitten, burned, and other horrible things. And the scandal was worse than he could have imagined. He was horrified. Like, literally, as they walked into the entryway, there were women's bodies just laying there. Because, like I said, there were so many girls that she was killing. They didn't know what to do with the bodies. So at this point, they were just leaving them around. He said that the smell was so horrible and so awful, he would never forget the sight. And we don't know this for sure, but it's assumed that he actually caught her in the act of torturing one of the girls. So, of course, she immediately starts blaming her servants and claims that she is innocent and that she was forced to do it and it wasn't her fault. Her servants were the ones who did it. Well, 360 people would end up testifying against Elizabeth, including some victims who actually escaped and servants who had ended up cleaning up after all of the torturing and killing. So there were some really good, reliable witnesses in these people. And again, a lot of them were peasants, though. So they didn't take their testimonies as seriously as they normally would if you were an upperclassman. But with that many people testifying against her, they couldn't ignore it. And it's thought that she killed between 50 to 680 women and girls. We don't know the for sure total because, again, they didn't keep track of peasants and they didn't keep track of servants. So we have no way to fully know the depth of the killings that she actually committed. So the best guess is between 50 to 680 women. I'm guessing it's closer to the 680 personally because of the isolation that she experienced and the access to so many girls and women. I have no doubt that she ended up killing that many people. Now, in the trial, including the testimonies, they even pulled out some of the bodies and examined them to see how these women would have died. And they did see that none of them died of natural causes. Like Elizabeth would claim. She would claim that a lot of them were dying of illness or of natural causes or an accident or something. But most of them had wounds and injuries that were not natural. And so they knew that they had not died a natural death. And Elizabeth actually never went to trial for her crimes. She never had to go to trial and face the wrath of the people. Now, some people believe that's because at that point in time, there was a very tensions laden relationship between upper class and lower class. they were walking a very fine line, very tightrope to not cause the peasants to revolt. And if the peasants had seen the atrocities committed against their daughters and their sisters and their wives and those kinds of things, it would have caused chaos in Hungary. So they didn't send her to trial. And she was only charged with the deaths of the noble girls she had killed. They didn't charge her for any of the peasants or any of her servants that she killed. It was just the upper class girls, the noble girls, that she got charged for. Her accomplices, on the other hand, ironically confessed to all the awful things as they were tortured. So, to get a confession out of all of them, they tortured all of her accomplices. Wah, wah, wah. So, like I said, this was a brutal, brutal time in history. And they truly believed that a confession through torture was the most honest confession. So they tortured all of her accomplices to get a confession that Elizabeth had committed all of those atrocities. Now, I'm going to tell you the fate of all of her accomplices. So Janos, the disfigured dwarf, was actually the youngest of the accomplices. So because of his youth, they just beheaded him and then burned his body. So kind. They were so nice to just behead him. And I'm not being facetious when I say that, because Joe and Dorca had all of their fingers pulled off with hot pliers. So pliers stuck in a fire, glowing hot, grabbed the fingers and pulled them off. Then they were put to death, and then their bodies were thrown onto the fire with Janos. Catelyn was spared because she had tried to show mercy to some of the victims. Like I had mentioned, she was trying to bring them food and water, and they knew that she had been beaten because of her trying to be kind to these individuals. So instead of killing her or torturing her, she received a life sentence. So she ended up in jail for the rest of her life. Now, Elizabeth, and Anna, by the way, if you're wondering, because you'll notice I didn't mention Anna, she died before they were caught. So she got off scot-free. So I'm sure in the afterlife she faced a lot of consequences, but she did not get any punishment here. So Elizabeth, she actually got off pretty easy. Like I said, she didn't go to trial, but she was convicted of killing a few of the noble girls. She was placed under house arrest. Now, there are a couple different rumors of how this house arrest went. Some people believe that she basically just went home and had guards around her home and basically lived the life she was living before. She was living in seclusion, had servants to take care of her every whim, and had no qualms with the way she was living, because it was basically how she was living before. She just couldn't torture people. But there are also rumors that when she received the house arrest, they actually walled her into a room and left just enough of a slit to slide food into her. And that is where she spent the rest of her life, alone in isolation in this room. Now, they think that they discovered she had died when they slid food under the door and it wasn't touched. So they assumed that she had died. Well, I don't know which one's fully true, because some places said it was that. Some places said she got to live her normal life. I honestly think she probably got to live out her life pretty normally. But she was very unrepentant, blamed everyone, felt no guilt, never confessed that it was her fault. I'm guessing would probably have done it again if she could have. So either way, whichever punishment really did happen, I hope it's the one she got walled up. That would be the best kind of punishment. But because she was part of the upper class and part of the noble group of people, I don't think that's what happened. So her friend that did the investigation, Terso, actually would come and visit her. He would be the only one to come and visit her. Her children refused to come and see her. Absolutely refused. Because I'm sure they had no idea about what was going on. And when it came to light, they wanted nothing to do with their mother. But Terso came and he said to Elizabeth, I love this so much, that he was her only friend, and he went to see her, and he said to her face, you, Elizabeth, are a wild animal. You are in the last months of your life. You do not deserve to breathe the air on the earth or see the light of the Lord. You shall disappear from this world and shall never reappear in it again. As the shadows envelop you, may you find time to repent of your bestial life. Oh man, I love that guy. He's so great. So he had promised his friend to look after his wife, and then his wife pulled this, and the fact that he said this straight up to her face was phenomenal. Soon after this visit where he said this to her, on August 21st, 1614, Elizabeth actually wasn't feeling well. And this is another reason why I don't think she was locked in that room, because we have records of this. In 1614, she wasn't feeling well, and her guards actually told her she should go lay down and rest and go to sleep, and she never woke up. So she died on August 21st, 1614. And they tried to destroy all the records of her, kind of like a Voldemort scenario. It was like a she shall not be named kind of situation. It was so awful and so horrible. They wanted no records anywhere showing that this happened in their country. They tried to bury it and burn everything to make sure no one would know about what happened. But when she died, her body was actually buried in the church cemetery. But when locals heard that her body was buried in their cemetery and that she was a murderer, they freaked out, like full on revolt, like demanding that her body be moved. They did not want it anywhere near their loved ones because it was tainted and it was evil. So they supposedly moved her body, but we actually don't know where it's buried anymore, because where they thought it was buried, they actually dug up, I think it was in the 90s, and there was no body in there. There was no skeleton, nothing. So no one actually knows where her body is buried anymore, which, you know, fine by me. She was horrible. Like, oh, she was gross. So now there's a couple of difference, because her story's so old and it inspired a lot of different legends and stories. There's a lot of different takes that people have on her story. And one of them, guys, I can't even with one of them, but we'll talk about that in a second. So a lot of people believed that she was actually bisexual and really got sexual thrills out of the torture. She was known to be very sexually active, and that's why the story of her getting pregnant before she got married is pretty believable, because she very active in that sense, and she really got a thrill from hurting other people. So I feel like that's a pretty well-known fact, but it is still up for debate because we don't know for sure if she was bisexual or not, but the fact that she only tortured women and she was happily married with children leads me to believe that she probably was. Some people believe, in my research, these are some of the crazy theories that I came across. Some people believe that because the world was run by men at the time and they wanted her land and her property, that they made up all of these rumors, and all of this was made up to get her out of power and to spread out the wealth and spread it to the men so the men could take over. That is, in my mind, such baloney. And it is true that men kind of dominated, but Elizabeth was such a powerful force. I don't think they would have been able to get away with that. And there's too much evidence that supports the fact that she tortured these girls. And it wasn't just a rumor started by a bunch of jealous men. So, and then this is a rumor that she's most well known for. There are stories that she would bathe in the blood of the women that she killed. So the story goes that a servant girl was brushing her hair and brushed it a little too hard and it snagged and it like made her head jerk a little bit. So Elizabeth turned around and punched the servant as hard as she could and gave her a bloody nose. Well, the blood supposedly fell onto Elizabeth, and she noticed that wherever the blood touched had a rejuvenating quality. And so this convinced her that she needed to start bathing in the blood of these young girls. Now, this tale came about in the 19th century, so it's probably not true. And there probably was a lot of blood everywhere because of the torturing. And a lot of people believe that because there was so much blood, that's why people kind of believed that she was bathing in blood. But there's no proof that that actually happened. But this inspired Countess Dracula. This is where the inspiration from Countess Dracula and her biting her servants and ripping off flesh, that also inspired Countess Dracula. So there are those strange rumors. Now, this last one, this is the one that makes me just, I can't. One of the documentaries, it was really funny watching this theory come from one doctor of history and then the reaction of another doctor. I'll tell you what it is, but it just, oh my goodness. So this is a theory. They believe that Elizabeth could have potentially been a healer. She was actually a doctor trying experimental things on these women to try and help them and heal them. And a lot of them ended up dying in the process. And she was probably performing illegal abortions. And she was actually just a really kind-hearted soul who was really trying to help women. And it just appeared that she wasn't because so many of them died in her trying to heal them. Seriously? The doctor's reaction after this theory in the documentary I was watching was like, "You've gotta be kidding." He was very upset at that idea. And I am too. I'm a little offended because her whole basis was, well, she was a good mother. So there's no way she could be this horrible person. And like I mentioned before, there were plenty of Nazis that were really good parents, but they were horrible, horrible people. It is very possible for people to have dual personalities. Like, there are serial killers that have been married and had children and were happy and good with their kids, but on their off time, they would go and kill people. It is possible for that to happen. And so the idea that she was trying to heal people and, it's just laughable. It is just so laughable. I can't even, it's ridiculous. Anyways, so because Elizabeth was so cruel, so sadistic, that she tortured and killed women just because she could, just because of her status, is what makes Elizabeth Bathory our horrible human of the week. Now, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Do you think Elizabeth Bathory is worse? H.H. Holmes? I don't know. Jolly Jane? Who do you think is the worst serial killer? I want to hear from you. Tell me what you guys think. And make sure you join us next week, because next week, oh boy, we're going a little bit of a different route. We're going to go into a cult leader. We love those cults. And his name is Jim Jones. And some of you have probably heard about him. He is super creepy, and he led over 900 people they commit suicide. So we're going to talk about him and his legacy. I hope you enjoyed our episode of HHH today, where we talk about our horrible humans. Be sure to subscribe so you get notified when our new episodes come out, and be sure to share with your friends. We'll see you guys next week.